I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Zoominar producer, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program, What's So Funny About Jewish Humor, with author William Novak. You are in for a real treat today. Please know that today's session is being recorded. You can type your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try and get to as many questions as possible at the end of the session. Following today's program, please visit Moment's website, where you will find a variety of articles, including many on Jewish and Israeli humor. Be sure to register for next week's Zoominar, From Folktales and Fables to Harry Potter, Yiddish Storytelling for a New Generation. Now for today's program. Please note, since only you will be able to hear yourself laugh during today's Zoominar, we have invited a few people to join us live, so the laughter you hear today is not a laugh track. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce William Novak. William is co-editor with Moshe Walduks of the Big Book of Jewish Humor, which was first published in 1981 and is still in print today. Bill has a special connection to Moment magazine, as he was an editor and a writer for Moment during its first 3 years, beginning in 1975. A well-known ghostwriter, he has co-authored, among other works, the memoirs of Lee Iacocca, Tip O'Neill, Oliver North, Nancy Reagan, Tim Russert, Magic Johnson, and Natan Sharansky. His latest book is Die Laughing, Killer Jokes for Newly Old Folks. Please welcome William Novak.
Thank you, Suzanne, and hello, everybody, and thanks for coming in really wonderful numbers. I appreciate that. I'm in my kitchen in Newton, Massachusetts. I thought you had to be standing or sitting in front of books. Apparently, that's not carved in stone. So there are no books behind me, but you do have the right place. I'm here with my wife, Linda, and our son, one of our sons, Jesse, and his wife, Peony. And I hope they'll be laughing a little, but I just didn't, I explained to Suzanne, and what a pleasure to work with Suzanne on this, to Suzanne, whom we just met. I explained to her that I didn't want to tell jokes into complete silence. I realized that with, at the moment, 860 people on this call, that we had to mute virtually everybody, but a couple of friends and the three of us and our family are unmuted, so there'll be at least a little bit of laughter. So let's begin. It was said that the great Talmudic sage known as Rabbah used to begin every lecture with a joke. And because of his reputation, and because this custom of his is mentioned in the Talmud, I think it's safe to infer that starting with a joke was thought to be a good idea. But what do you do when your presentation is all about jokes? Do you still begin with a joke? So nobody asked this question, but I did. And I did the smart thing. I asked my wife, and she said, of course you should start with a joke, so I will. The head of a small yeshiva in New Jersey somehow gets the idea that his school should put together a rowing team. And they do, but in every single race, they finish dead last. Finally, frustrated by the team's poor showing, the head of the yeshiva says to the captain of the crew, we must be doing something wrong. I want you to go up to Harvard, spend a couple of days watching, maybe watching from the bushes, don't be obvious, see how they do it. And a couple of days later, when the captain returns, the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, says to him, what did you learn? He says, Rabbi, it's a good thing I went. At Harvard, they have 8 guys rowing and 1 guy yelling. So we'll start with a few minutes on the history of Jewish humor and some of the values reflected in classic Jewish jokes. But as time passes, I have a feeling I'll be telling more and more jokes with less and less commentary. And I hope to tell you a few jokes that you've never heard before. Some of these jokes will include Jewish words that a few people in the audience may not know. I'll translate many of them when that doesn't hurt the joke. But my real problem is I have so many jokes I'd love to tell you that I was wondering, how can I squeeze an hour's worth of jokes into 45 minutes? Then I had the idea that I would start by giving you the punchlines only of 7 classic Jewish jokes that I hope will ring a bell. And in case I don't get to those jokes today, at least you'll know how they end. And if they don't ring a bell, I know the perfect place for you to find these jokes, and I'll tell you that soon enough. So here are the 7 punchlines. And if you hate this idea, it'll be over in 1 minute. First punchline, am I comfortable? I make a living. Second punchline, if you had a bad week, should I suffer? Third punchline, he had a hat. My friend Moshe can stretch that joke to 10 or 15 minutes. Fourth punchline, number 4, you know what, says the rabbi, you're right too. Fifth punchline, over there, that's the shul I don't go to. Sixth punchline, you don't have to whisper, says the shadchan. She's deaf too. And the 7th and final punchline, but what if we gave Yossel a ruble a week? If we gave Yossel a ruble a week, what would he have to worry about? Well, don't worry. From here on, I promise I'll tell the entire jokes. Like all Jewish texts, Jewish jokes are rich with commentary. Did you know that Sigmund Freud wrote a whole book of interpretations of classic Jewish jokes? It was called Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious. It was published in 1905. And among other things, Freud made the point that now seems obvious, but it wasn't back then, that although Jewish humor is often self-critical, it's entirely different than the kind of jokes that might be told by anti-Semites. Now, I mentioned that Jewish jokes are rich with commentaries, but more than that, the jokes themselves are commentaries, not usually on other texts, but on almost everything else. They are commentaries on professions, on problems, authority figures, on religion, and perhaps more than anything else, they are commentaries that deal with human weakness and hypocrisy. In other words, Jewish jokes are commentaries on life itself. So when did Jewish humor start? There are those who say it began in the Torah, but really, is the Torah funny? I don't think so. Right away, there's a murder. And why did Cain kill Abel? Yesh omrim, there are those who say, the real reason Cain killed his brother was because Abel insisted on telling him a joke he had heard 100 times already. Well, that takes care of Genesis. Moving on to Exodus. There are people who think the 10 plagues were funny. Really? How exactly does that work? Well, wait, maybe the second plague, frogs. In Hebrew, of course, it's not frogs, plural, it's the word Spardeia, which is singular. The great sage Rabbi Akiva famously suggested that the reason the second plague was called Spardeia rather than Spardeim, which would be the plural, was that instead of many frogs, maybe there was one gigantic frog, a colossal Kermit who terrorized the Egyptians. Okay, that's funny. Vayikra, Leviticus, don't even ask. But after the Torah, we have the Talmud. Is the Talmud funny? Well, here and there, you'll find funny parts, but you have to look pretty hard. In the tractate, the section known as Bava Batra, there's a law that reads, if a baby bird is found within 50 cubits of a birdhouse, it belongs to the owner of the birdhouse. If it's beyond 50 cubits, it belongs to the person who found it. Whereupon Rabbi Jeremiah, we read, asked, but what if one foot of the bird is within the 50 cubits and the other foot is outside? Then what's the law? And here comes a wonderful line. It is for this question that Rabbi Jeremiah was removed from the house of study. He was evidently the class clown, a wise guy. So while you can probably find a tiny bit of humor in the Torah and a little in the Talmud, the first golden age of Jewish humor was in Eastern Europe during the 19th century. The second, if you're wondering, was in North America during the 20th century. And I'm starting to think that the third golden age of humor is taking place right now in Israel. And that's not a political comment, although I guess it could be. The 19th century gave rise to what we usually call traditional Jewish humor. And like all joke-based humor, it comes to us anonymously. But well before the 19th century, we had the earliest versions of the Wise Men of Chelm, the story that many of us grew up on. Chelm, or Chelem in Yiddish, is an imaginary town of fools that also shows up under various names in many other European folklores. Now, it's true, there is a real Polish city of Chelm, not far from Lublin, and it had a population, a Jewish population, going back to the 14th century. But that town was actually known for its scholars. And I learned this week that the first Yiddish publication of Chelm-like stories appeared, this is hard to believe, in 1597. And it described a German town, oddly enough, called Schildberg. Well, over the years, these Chelm stories were repeated and added to and became known as Chelm stories. And the writers who worked on them, often writing them for children, have included Yud Lamed Peretz and, more recently, Isaac Bashevis Singer. In our family, we talk about Chelm all the time. And someday I'm determined to come up with a sweatshirt that reads Chelm State College. In a Chelm story whose punchline I quoted earlier in that list of 7, the people of Chelm were warriors. And they worried about that. They worried that they were too worried. Then they came up with a solution. They decided to appoint one man, Yossel, who would be retained by the town to do all the worrying on behalf of the entire community. And for this, he would be paid 1 ruble every week. The townspeople were celebrating this brilliant idea when one of the wisest men in all of Chelm stood up and said, "Friends, wait a minute. If Yossel earns 1 ruble every week, what would he have to worry about?" Now, here's a Chelm story I certainly never heard as a child and whose authenticity I can't vouch for, but I love it anyway. One day, the residents of Chelm decided to deal with the high price of beer by making their own. After months of trying different recipes, they finally chose what they thought was the very best one. And they make a small batch of beer and they send it off to Warsaw for certification. 2 weeks later comes a telegram. "We regret to inform you that your horse has diabetes." It's not just Chelm stories. Traditional Jewish humor has a special fondness for logic and the workings of the mind. 2 rival businessmen meet in the Warsaw train station. "Where are you going?" says the first one. "Me? I'm going to Minsk," his rival replies. "What chutzpah telling me that? You're telling me you're going to Minsk because you want me to think you're really going to Pinsk. But I happen to know you actually are going to Minsk. So why are you lying to me?" And a joke about logic that's a special favorite in my own family. An elderly Jew walks up to the window at the main post office in Pinsk. "Excuse me," he says, "how often does the mail go from here to Warsaw?" "To Warsaw," says the clerk, "every day." The old man is silent for a moment, and then he says, "Thursdays too?" Why is this joke funny? Or why do I think it's funny? Because it points to our insecurity, to the part of the Jewish DNA, a well-earned part, unfortunately, that reminds us that we can't be too careful, that we shouldn't take too much for granted, that it's always a good idea to measure twice or more than twice and cut once. And that reminds me of a new joke. I should explain that when I say new joke, in this case, I'm spelling it N-U. In fact, it is an old joke, and it's, excuse me, and it's sometimes told as a Chelm story. 2 men are having tea, and one says, "Here's a riddle for you. What's green, hangs on the wall, and whistles?" His friend thinks long and hard and finally gives up. He says, "I have no idea." "Okay, what's green, hangs on the wall, and whistles?" "A herring," says the first man triumphantly. "Wait a minute, a herring isn't green." "Well, you could paint it green, and a herring doesn't hang on the wall. You could hang it on the wall, and a herring doesn't whistle." "No, so it doesn't whistle." Logic and the life of the mind is a big theme of Jewish humor. So, in a very different way, are schnorrers. A schnorrer, of course, is a beggar, but I prefer the definition of Moshe Waldachs, my longtime friend and collaborator, who describes and defines a schnorrer as a poor Jew with middle-class values. Millions of Americans first learned the word from the Marx Brothers movie Animal Crackers, where a whole crowd sings hooray for Captain Spaulding, the African explorer, and Groucho interjects, did someone call me schnorrer? Now, one interesting thing about schnorrer jokes is that some schnorrer jokes are at the expense of the schnorrer. Now, why is that interesting? Because Jewish humor never mocks the weaker members of society. So from this, we learn that the schnorrer was actually powerful. It's true, he had no money, he had little influence, but he did have wit and sarcasm and attitude, and most of all, he had moral authority. And why did the schnorrer have moral authority? Because we don't give tzedakah, usually translated as therapy, we don't give it out of the goodness of our hearts. We hope it will come from the goodness of our hearts, but in case it doesn't, giving isn't optional, it's commanded. Even when we don't feel like giving, we must give. Tzedakah, after all, comes from the Hebrew word tzedek, which means justice. The other day, I was curious. I looked up tzedakah in the dictionary, not knowing if I'd find it in an English language dictionary. I did. It said, charitable giving typically seen as a moral obligation. Exactly. In a story where the schnorrer is not victorious, he knocks on Mrs. Cohen's door. He says, lady, I haven't eaten in 3 days. No, she says, you should force yourself. In another version, he says, I haven't eaten in 3 days. She says, I wish I had your willpower. In a more conventional schnorrer story, and this is one of the first jokes I ever learned as a child, a woman invited a schnorrer into her house and sat him at the kitchen table and gave him a nice meal. There was brisket, there was potatoes, there was maybe a vegetable. There was also a plate of bread, 2 slices of black bread and 2 slices of challah. Well, the schnorrer ignored the black bread and he quickly polished off the challah. Lady, he said, this challah is terrific. Can you bring me a little more? Well, she said, you know, there's black bread there too, and challah is very expensive. I know, said the schnorrer, but believe me, lady, it's worth it. Here's another one about tzedakah. A rabbi's wife says to her husband, I saw you deep in prayer this morning. Were you praying for anything in particular? Yes, he says, I was. I was praying that the wealthy members of our congregation will be more generous to those in need. A week later, she said, do you remember those prayers from last week? Were they answered? Well, says the rabbi, they were half answered. What do you mean? She says. Well, he says, the poor are willing to receive. And speaking of rich and poor, Rothschild is traveling and he walks into a little restaurant in the middle of nowhere and he orders some eggs. And when the check comes, the total comes to 20 rubles. Waiter, he says, 20 rubles. Are eggs so rare in these parts? No, says the waiter, but Rothschilds are. Another common theme of classic Jewish jokes is the shadchan. A shadchan is, of course, a matchmaker, a practice that most people wouldn't even consider today, except that it often works. And I can vouch for that because back in the 80s, my wife, Linda, whom I met through a friend who played matchmaker, my wife, Linda, was a matchmaker, and she made a number of marriages here in the Boston area. In fact, I think matchmaking is still popular in North America, but we don't recognize it because it's done by computers through dating apps. But elsewhere in the world, did you know there's a popular reality show on Netflix called Indian Matchmaker? It's common in many other countries. In one classic joke, and it used to be common in Jewish society, in one classic joke, the shadchan brings a young man to visit the girl and her family, a family whose virtue whose virtues he's been extolling. As soon as they leave the house, he says to the boy, "Did you notice the quality of the silverware on the table? Pure sterling." "Well, I did notice," says the young man, "but don't you think they might have borrowed that silverware to make a good impression?" "Don't be silly," says the shadchan. "Who would lend their good silver to people like that?" We see this in a lot of shadchan jokes where the matchmaker will exaggerate or dissemble or even lie until at some point he just can't stop himself from blurting out the truth. When you collect jokes, there's a special thrill from hearing a new one, especially if it's good. A few years ago, Moshe and I were guests on Tom Ashbrook's syndicated radio program, On Point. We were promoting the 25th anniversary edition of the Big Book of Jewish Humor. We told some of our favorite jokes, and our host invited listeners to call in with their own. This could have been dangerous, but a woman from North Carolina surprised us with this joke, which neither of us had heard before. A rather observant family is concerned that their 30-year-old son still isn't married. So they bring in a shadchan who asks the young man a lot of questions about himself and the kind of young lady he might be looking for. And the young man responds, as you might expect, she should be attractive, well-educated, spirited, have a good sense of humor, everything you'd hope to hear. And 3 weeks later, the shadchan returns and meets with the family. And he tells them about a girl named Rivka, who sounds perfect in every way. The parents are already planning the wedding, at least in their minds, but the son hasn't said a word. "What's the matter? Is everything okay?" says the shadchan. I do have one question, the son says. "This girl, is she good in bed?" There's a long, awkward pause. "Well," says the shadchan, "that's a tough one. Some say yes, some say no." In the 1950s, when I was a boy in Toronto, I read jokes about schnorrers and shadchans, but certainly not that joke, in a book by Nathan Ozabel called A Treasury of Jewish Folklore. For me, and maybe for some of you, these classic jokes were more than entertaining. They also provided us with a link to an important part of Jewish tradition that nobody was teaching in Hebrew schools or synagogues, where I believe that educators were missing and are still missing a wonderful tool. Jewish jokes are a terrific way to learn about Jewish history, traditions, religious practice, and most of all, Jewish values. Oh, I see it's time for another joke. Here's a cute one that I received 2 or 3 times this week, most recently from my friend Peter in New York, so it must be going around. A woman goes to the post office to buy stamps for her Hanukkah greeting cards. "Do you have any Hanukkah stamps?" she asked. "We sure do," says the clerk. "What denominations would you like?" The woman says, "Oh, it's come to this. Okay, let's see. Maybe 7 Orthodox, 12 Conservative, 16 Reform." You may know that in the shtetl communities of Eastern Europe, little children were introduced to Jewish learning with a taste of honey or a piece of candy. For some of us growing up a century later, Jewish humor played a similar role. The reason Moshe and I put together the Big Book of Jewish Humor back in 1981, that's 40 years ago, is that we wanted there to be a collection of humor for our own generation, and especially for our children, even though most of our kids weren't born yet. At the time, you could find any number of Jewish joke books and collections of short stories, but that's about it. We were thinking, why shouldn't a Jewish humor book carry selections from Philip Roth and Woody Allen and Bruce J. Friedman? Why shouldn't a Jewish humor book carry a parody of Fiddler on the Roof from Mad Magazine, or a routine from Myron Cohen, or a song lyric from Alan Sherman? And what if we designed our book like a classic Jewish text with small print commentary in the margins? Well, a few years ago, we published, as you heard, the 25th anniversary of the book. It looks like this. And if you find yourself buying it, you want with the stripe that says 25th anniversary, because it was time to update the original. And at that point, we added about 100 jokes that we didn't even know about in 1981. We also described and quoted from Jon Stewart, Jerry Seinfeld, Curb Your Enthusiasm, and of course, Borat. And we included our friend Jonathan Katz, whose best known line goes like this. I was having dinner with my father last night, and I made a classic Freudian slip. I meant to say, please pass the salt, but it came out, you schmuck, you ruined my childhood. Not too long ago, as I was approaching the once frightening age of 70, I had the idea for a book of jokes for and about older people. I had a feeling there were a lot of these jokes and that many of them were good, and I think that's true. The book is called Die Laughing, Killer Jokes for Newly Old Folks, and it looks like this. Here's the joke that inspired the book. I bet you've heard it, and I bet you've heard it more than once. It's not specifically a Jewish joke, but it could pass. A long married couple in their late 70s are having dinner at the home of old friends. When the meal is over, something strange happens. Imagine this, the women get up to clear the dishes while the men remain at the table and continue talking. I know that's hard to believe, but I've seen it happen. Charlie, says the host, we went to a terrific new restaurant in Brookline the other night, and you and Marcia would just love it. Great, great. What's it called? What's it called? Well, they said, oh, hell, I'm blanking. Help me out here. What's that red flower? A poppy. No, the other one. A carnation. No, with thorns. A rose. Thank you. Turning toward the kitchen, he yells, Rose, what's the name of that restaurant? That to me is the quintessential joke about growing older. When people heard I was putting together a collection of jokes about growing older, that's the one they told me most often. Why is it so popular? I think it's because forgetting names, mostly of people, but it can be of books or movies or restaurants, is the most common early symptom of aging. And by itself, it's nothing to worry about. But here's another joke that may indicate that there could be something to worry about. A woman of a certain age calls her daughter, says, Judy, could you come over and give me a hand? Sure, Mom, what's wrong? Well, it's nothing serious, but this puzzle I'm working on is impossible. I'm normally very good at these, but I'm getting nowhere on this one. She says, sure, Mom, I'll come after lunch. What's the puzzle supposed to look like when it's done? The mother says, well, how should I know? I can't seem to do it. Well, says the daughter, isn't there a picture on the box? Oh, yes, of course. Yes, it's a big rooster. Okay, and the daughter arrives. She sees the pieces spread out all over the table. She says, Mom, I don't know about this one. But the mother says, I've always been good at puzzles. Just get me started. Well, says the daughter, first I'm going to make you a nice cup of tea. And then we'll put all the cornflakes back in the box. There seems to be a connection between older people and Jews, and I think it goes beyond the fact that Jews are an old people. Older Jews often appear in these jokes, and in real life they, or should I say now we tell jokes. In fact, many older Jews who love jokes wish that our kids would love them as we do. When the big book of Jewish humor came out, and I was working with Lee Iacocca on his memoir, I interviewed a man named Gerald Greenwald, who was the CFO of Chrysler. And because he was obviously Jewish, I gave him the Jewish humor book. Great, he said, I'll give this to my parents. No, I wanted to say, it's for you. Now, I was telling you about Die Laughing, and I hope you'll let me show you some New Yorker cartoons that appear in that book. I don't hear any objection. And Suzanne has kindly offered to put a few of them on the screen. I will read the captions for you because sometimes the captions are too small to see. Two men meeting at a cocktail party. One guy sticks out his hand and says, hi, I'm you'll have to forgive me. I'm terrible with names. That, by the way, is by Bob Mankoff, who did one of the very best moment Zoominars a few months ago. In fact, I think he did more than one. He's terrific. Next one, please. Suzanne, can you hear me? Okay, a man is in the hospital. He's bandaged up. from head to toe. There's only his eye is sticking out, and the doctor is saying, I don't like the look of that eye. Next one, please. A man is walking out of the doctor's office. A woman who is obviously his wife is in the waiting room. He says, "Good news, honey. Dr. Bigham," who's rather younger and attractive, Dr. Bigham couldn't detect any impotence. A little nodded. A man is sitting on the doctor's table. The doctor says, "This is a second opinion. At first, I thought you had something else." Next one, please. This one is so popular. I put it on the back cover of the book. It's hard to read. It's a Roz Chast cartoon of a man reading the obituaries, and the headlines read, 2 years younger than you, 12 years older than you, 3 years your junior, your age on the dot. These are the headlines of the various obituaries. Okay. Next one, please. There's a couple more. A woman who apparently has just passed away, and the man is saying, "Oh, damn, I forgot to get her kugel recipe." Next one, please. I guess a man is wearing we're at the pearly gates. A man is wearing a shirt that says "Shit happens," and he tells the angel just before he gets up there, "I'd like to go back and change my shirt." And I think there's one or two more. Yes, this is the last one. Here lies Frederick Jones, verbal 680, math 720. So they do count, it turns out. Okay, thank you, Suzanne. Those are a few cartoons just to change the pace. And they're all in the book, Die Laughing, and many more. Those of us who are baby boomers grew up at a time when people still told jokes. And we took it for granted that this is what comedians did. But for many years now, comedians have not been telling jokes. None of them tell jokes. They all do routines. And many of those routines are wonderful. Remember jokes? A priest, a minister, and a rabbi walk into a bar. Or 3 nuns meet St. Peter at the pearly gates. Although comedians have long ago stopped telling jokes on stage, jokes are still around. And one aim of the 2 books I showed you, and of this presentation, is to help jokes stay around, because jokes, both Jewish and of any other kind, jokes are in danger of slipping away, and it would be a shame to use them. Did I say use them? Lose them. Lose them or use them or lose them, I guess. Okay. It's a good thing I know. That was helpful then. We were talking about traditional Jewish jokes, and as you'd expect, a lot of them deal with anti-Semitism. Each of these topics could sustain an entire lecture, by the way, but in our limited time together, I can only scratch the surface. In the 19th and early 20th century, there were areas in Tsarist Russia where Jews were not allowed to live. A businessman by the name of Rabinovich was traveling with a fake passport that carried a Gentile name. When the train reached a checkpoint, all the passports were gathered up, and when it was time to return them, Rabinovich was so nervous, so anxious, he couldn't remember the false name he had used. And as the official is giving back the passports, he says, "What's your name?" And our traveler pauses for a moment, and all he can think of is, says, "Well, one thing for sure, it's not Rabinovich." Here's a more contemporary joke, one that nobody in the 19th century would have understood, because back then every Jew knew at least a little about his or her heritage. Mendel, a man whose bank account exceeds his education, comes to the rabbi and says, "Rabbi, I want to become a Levi." "A Levi? Mr. Mendel," says the rabbi, "with all due respect, I can't just make you a Levi. It doesn't work that way." Rabbi says, "I knew you'd give me a hard time. If you make me a Levi, I'm prepared to pay for a new classroom for the Hebrew school." "That's very generous," says the rabbi, "but as I said, it doesn't work that way." "Well, Rabbi, you drive a hard bargain. I'm willing to pay the salary of 3 new teachers." "Mr. Mendel, you don't understand." "Okay, I see what you're doing," Mendel says. "So here's my final offer. If you make me a Levi, I'll do the 2 things I mentioned, and I'll add a whole new wing to the Hebrew school, but we have to do it right. We'll have a big dinner. I'll pay for that too. And you'll pronounce me a Levi in front of everybody." Well, because of his dedication to Jewish education, the rabbi agrees. After the dinner and the awarding of the certificate, the two of them are alone for a moment. Mr. Mendel, says the rabbi, it's such a generous gift you've given, but I'm curious, why was it so important for you to become a Levi? Well, Rabbi, he says, it's like this. My father was a Levi. My grandfather was a Levi. Now, it's too late to ruin the joke by explaining it, but if you need a bit of help, a Levi is a descendant of the biblical priestly tribe, the Levites, which means that the title is simply inherited. That, of course, was a joke about Jewish ignorance. Here's one at the very opposite of the spectrum, a joke about detailed Jewish knowledge. I heard it from my friend Jerry Samet, and I have to tell you, it's an extreme joke. And about half of every Jewish audience doesn't get it because it requires some background. And I can't really explain it because you know what happens when you explain a joke. It's not funny. It might help to know that on Shabbos, on the Sabbath, a strictly observant Jew is not permitted to carry anything outside the home unless the neighborhood has an eruv, a boundary made of string or wire that extends the idea of private space into what would normally be considered public space. This is also a long joke, so if you're new to Jewish learning, this might be a good time to grab a snack. Every Shabbos afternoon, Yaakov goes to the local park, sits down on a bench, and learns a page of Talmud. One day, another man sits down beside him, a stranger. He says, "What's that you've got there?" "It's the Talmud," says Yaakov, fully expecting that this will end the conversation, but it doesn't. "What masechet are you learning?" says the man. "What section?" Yaakov is surprised, but he answers, "I'm working my way through Sanhedrin." "Well, that's a long one," said the stranger, "and the death penalty is on the books, but they never want to enforce it. Would you like some company?" "Why not?" says Yaakov. "Well, for the next 3 years, the two of them learn together in the park every Shabbos afternoon." And from this, by the way, we infer that they must be living in a warm climate. But that's not the joke. One afternoon, Yaakov says, "You know, my son's bar mitzvah is coming up next month. I've enjoyed studying with you so much that I'd love to invite you and honor you with an aliyah." "That's very kind," says the other man, "but I can't accept." "Oh, don't worry," says Yaakov. "I go to the strictest shul in the neighborhood. We do everything by the book." I'm sure you do," says the other man, "but I can't accept the honor." "Why not?" says Yaakov. He says, "I'd rather not say." But Yaakov persists. Eventually, he wears down his companion, who says, "The reason I can't accept this honor is that I'm not Jewish." "What? You're kidding me. Come on." "No," he says, "it's true." "But what about your learning? You really understand this stuff." "What can I say? I do love it, and I enjoy the challenge." "But wait," says Yaakov, "didn't we learn together that a Gentile is not supposed to keep the Jewish Sabbath?" "Of course I know that," says the companion, "and that's why I carry my house key with me in my pocket every week." "A key," says Yaakov, "but there's an eruv here." "Oh yeah, I know," says the stranger, "but I don't hold by that eruv." This next one, far easier to understand, describes a much earlier time in American Jewish history. This joke is fairly new to me. I've never heard anyone else tell it. I found it on the internet, which is surprising because this one depends on hand gestures. So you'll need to look at the screen in case you were still enjoying that snack from the last joke. Back in frontier days, a Jewish peddler has to travel from San Francisco to Omaha, but the ticket is $5 and he has only $2. "Well, you can still travel with us," says the driver of the stagecoach, "but you'll have to ride shotgun." "You need a shotgun?" No, shotgun. "I'll give you a rifle, and if you see any Indians, you shoot them." "Shoot them," says the peddler. "I never shot anyone." "Well, it's not hard. You point the gun, you pull the trigger." The traveler shrugs and climbs aboard. A couple hours later, the driver says, "Do you see any Indians?" He said, yeah, I think I see one." He says, "How far away?" He says, "How should I know?" "Well, how big does he look?" The guy says, he looks this big. "Should I shoot him?" No, he's way too far away. Wait till he's closer." A couple of hours later, the driver says, "Do you see the engine?" "Yes," he says, and now he looks this big. Should I shoot him? No, no. He's far, far too distant. This goes on for hours, and every time the driver says, wait. On the third day, when the driver says, how big is he now? The peddler spreads his arms as wide as he can up and down to show the size of the Indian. Okay, he's that big? Shoot him. No, says the peddler, I can't shoot him. Why not? Are you kidding? I've known him since he was this big. Four men are walking in the desert. The German says, I'm tired and thirsty. I must have beer. The Italian says, I'm tired and thirsty. I must have wine. The Mexican says, I'm tired and thirsty. I must have a margarita. And the Jew says, I'm tired and thirsty. I must have diabetes. Are Jews more likely to be hypochondriacs? I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised. We score pretty high when it comes to neuroses, and we've always been interested in medicine. It's probably no accident that our greatest philosopher, Maimonides, was also a physician, and not just any physician, but the personal physician to the first Sultan of Egypt. I know a lot of doctor jokes, but we're getting near the end of the jokes. I have time for just one. I had the strangest dream last night. A young man was telling his psychiatrist, I saw my mother, but when she turned around, she had your face. Of course, I found this disturbing. I couldn't get back to sleep. I just lay in bed waiting for morning to come. And then I got up, I drank a Coke and came right here for my appointment, hoping you could help me understand the meaning of this dream. The psychiatrist was silent for a few seconds, and then he said, a Coke? That's a breakfast? Another doctor joke I'll squeeze in. I learned this too from Jerry Samet. Doctor, says the older patient, how am I doing? I'm afraid it looks serious, says the doctor. What do you mean? The doctor says, we may have to drain your bank account. Well, we're almost out of time for jokes. And I don't think I've told a single animal joke. So let's fix that right away. Mrs. Rosen, a widow, goes to her rabbi. Rabbi, you know I love birds. I bought 2 female parrots last week, but they keep saying the same awful thing. They say, hi, we're easy. Want to fool around? And that's all they say. And when I have company, I'm so embarrassed. That's terrible, said the rabbi, but I may have a solution. My cousin has 2 wonderful male parrots whom he taught to daven, and they spend hours in prayer. I think they may be a good influence on your birds, and they'll teach them some modesty. So the next day, Mrs. Rosen brings the rabbi's parrots into her house and puts their cage in the next room because the newcomers are wearing their little yarmulkes. They're doing the mincha prayers, the afternoon service. So she leaves them in the other room. And when they finish, she picks them up. She puts them in with her 2 females. And the females start talking like usual. Hi, we're easy. Want to fool around? Whereupon one of the new arrivals says to his buddy, Yossi, put away your prayer book. Our prayers have been answered. Well, all right, one more, because I haven't, we need at least one joke that's in bad taste, or very bad, perhaps. Grandpa Joe is on his deathbed, and as his family gathers round to say goodbye, he suddenly perks up, his eyes open wide, and he says, what's that I smell? And almost in unison, the family responds, it's Booby's apple cake. And he smiles like I didn't know. He says, listen, he whispers to his youngest grandchild, please go downstairs and ask Booby for a slice and bring it up to me. And the boy disappears. A couple minutes later, he returns. He says, I'm sorry, Grandpa. He says, it's for the Shiva. Well, I could go on, but apparently there are questions. And I promised you then I would stop by now, I guess. So unless you want me to tell another joke, Suzanne, it's over to you.
Thank you so much. And I can tell you that in the chat, lots of people are just typing in how fun that was. And thank you so much for making them laugh today. So thank you.
For me too, believe me.
So we do have quite a few questions. The first one is, do you think Jewish humor has changed over the years, and how? And
well,
why?
certainly the forms have changed. You know, I guess we'd have to put into the category Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song. We'd have to put certain episodes of Seinfeld, as Moshe has pointed out, the ones, they're not my favorite episodes, but the ones that take place in the small village in Florida where his parents live, where life is so petty, do have a certain resemblance to some Shalom Aleichem stories. We have routines. We have wonderful humor coming out of Israel in a medium, in video, that we never had before. I especially recommend a series called HaYehudim Ba'im, the Jews are coming, mostly biblical parodies of biblical stories, and they're really clever. And I've been watching a show in Hebrew called Zehu Zeh, which I guess we translate as That's That. We know there's some great Israeli television now dubbed and in English and with subtitles. It's not funny, for at least the shows I know, but it's high quality, and there is an equal amount of humor, at least in Israel, and it's available on the internet. So the forms have changed, and to some extent the subjects have changed. We don't have matchmaking jokes, we don't have schnorrer jokes. We have jokes that reflect more our own time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do you think that other groups that have suffered a great deal throughout their history have humor similar to Jews?
I don't think they have humor similar to Jews, and I don't think their humor is as well known in the American culture, but I am sure there's a rich tradition of Black humor, and we know there's a tradition of Irish humor, and the British are funny. They're not a minority group. But there is something there is something in the Jewish psyche that seems to lend itself to humor, and I think it's related to the fact that everything for us either is or requires commentary. We love to comment, and often that comment is funny.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What about women and Jewish jokes? Are there a lot of women comedians out there today? And in the past, who are telling really good Jewish jokes? And is there a difference between? There
are not many, but I think immediately, of course, of Sarah Silverman and Judy Gold and Susie Essman. Are they specifically overtly Jewish jokes? No, not usually, although with Sarah Silverman they are. There have never been as many Jewish women or women comedians as men, but there are some, and we'll probably, I hope, see more in the years to come.
Do you think that comedy coming from women is different than from men? Probably,
but I don't want to make up an answer on something I haven't thought about. So I'll go to the next question. I don't have a good answer.
Sure. And how can Jewish humor help us heal during these times of the pandemic?
Well, I think all humor helps us heal during the pandemic. That's why I want to do this one, and that's why there are at the moment 862 people here, which I was astounded. I would have been happy with 100. But this is great. We are watching a lot of comedy. Saturday Night Live is more important than ever. It's not always great, but what can always be great when it comes to brand new humor? Yes, we need humor. We need humor anyway, and we especially need it during this difficult time, which is going to get a little worse before it finally gets better. We hope in the spring.
Mm-hmm. Are there better ways to explain Jewish humor to people who don't get it? And are those numbers growing with fewer Jewish humorists visible?
Well, the question is, are Jews as educated as they used to be? They are not, but many are. I hope Jewish humor will continue, and I already forgot what the question was. So let's go to the next one.
Is there any connection between your Jewish humor and becoming a ghostwriter?
I don't think so. I always loved humor. I never was one of the funny kids, but I always loved to hang around with them. And I have wondered, what do all these people I've written books with have in common? What does big 6'9" Magic Johnson have in common with height challenge Natan Sharansky or Nancy Reagan. It helps to have a sense of humor when we're working with people. I'll tell you who had a sense of humor that I never expected, who was really funny. And you may not believe me. I wouldn't have believed this either. Oliver North was a very funny man, but you wouldn't know that from TV or from his testimony. Sharansky was funny. Nancy Reagan was capable of a joke. Iacocca, not so much. Tim Russert loved to laugh. So having a sense of humor helped me, but I'm not going to draw what I think might be an artificial connection between different parts of my work.
Mm-hmm. And how do you collect the jokes? What's your indexing system like?
Oh, I don't have any. I wish I had an indexing system. I try to write them down or put them at least in some kind of file or in my email. I mean, I get jokes. I don't go looking for them. I get them on email or I hear them. But I'll tell you, I hear a lot. I think we all do. I hear a lot fewer jokes than I used to even 10 years ago. They just aren't, people don't tell jokes. They say funny things or quote funny things, or they send around funny videos. There's plenty of humor around, and that's great. But I do miss the prevalence of jokes. Used to be you go to a conference or a meeting, but you can't do that now anyway. But when you could, you'd always hear, especially a Jewish meeting, you'd hear a few jokes. It's not the case now. And as I said, I hope sessions like this and books like the ones I showed you and others will help keep jokes alive.
Why do you think there is less joke telling these days?
Why? It's an interesting question. Why is there less joke telling these days? I don't know. It could be because there are so many other avenues of humor, whether it's songs or movies or sketch comedy. And maybe jokes just feel old-fashioned to people. Certainly, it's my sense that we're not getting jokes in the old sense from anyone under 40. I don't think they're telling them or interested in them, and I wish they would be, but things change.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think is the most distinctive way to identify a Jewish joke? In essence, what makes a joke Jewish?
What makes a joke Jewish? These are tough questions. I should have stayed with the jokes. Is it like pornography? I know it when I see it. Does it have a Jewish theme? Does it seem to speak to Jewish values? There are jokes I told today, I'm sure, that you would find also in collections of humor that are not Jewish. So there's plenty of drifting back and forth. Sometimes you know for sure, and sometimes you just have a feeling. I go with the feeling.
Do you have any reservations about Jewish self-deprecating humor being received by non-Jewish audiences?
I was going to repeat the question, but you all heard the question. I don't worry about this because if it's Jewish self-deprecating humor, and if I tell it, I've screened it first. I would not tell an anti-Semitic joke, which brings up an awful joke. An anti-Semite is someone who dislikes Jews more than necessary. But you didn't hear it from me. It's pretty witty.
Do you think that political correctness has influenced the telling of jokes today?
Absolutely, it's ruined the telling of jokes, and don't get me started. I'm sure there are jokes that I censored today without even knowing, without even realizing it, just because nobody wants to offend anybody. If nobody was offended today, I apologize. That means, humor should be offensive, and political correctness is a terrible thing for humor, and I think for more than humor, but that's another subject.
So why don't we end with, someone would like to know, what would you say is the greatest one-liner in the history of Jewish humor, maybe besides "Take My Wife"?
By the way, "Take my wife, please" was not said as a joke. Henny Youngman was at an event with his wife, and he was going to go to the microphone, and she was going to be seated in the audience, and he said to somebody, "Take my wife, please." And they laughed because they figured it was a joke. It was not. He actually meant it seriously. Can I finish with a joke that's not a one-liner?
Sure, go for it.
I have a friend named Bernie who, like many of us, keeps kosher at home, but will occasionally order more exotic fare in restaurants. And last summer, Bernie took his wife, Bernice, to Paris just to eat. And on the final night of their vacation, they went to dinner at a place called Chez Treif, where Bernie decides to spend all his remaining money on the least kosher thing on the menu, the roast suckling pig with creme sauce on the side. An hour goes by and the waiter, actually it was two waiters, carry in the pig with all the trimmings right down to the fruit in its mouth. But no sooner is it in front of Bernie than who should walk into the restaurant than Bernie's rabbi. And as the rabbi comes over to say hello, Bernie does some fast thinking and says, "Hello, Rabbi. Delighted to see you, but please be careful what you order here because this place really is elaborate. Why, just look at how they putchkey up a baked apple."
Thank you, Bill, very much. This was a delightful, funny presentation. I know that everybody has really enjoyed it. Just to let everybody know, it is recorded and it will be available in a few days on our website if you would like to enjoy it again or pass it along to somebody who has not seen it yet. Just a reminder that you can purchase both of Bill's books, The Big Book of Jewish Humor and Die Laughing, Killer Jokes for Newly Old Folks on Amazon, as well as his other books.
Or anywhere else you choose.
Anywhere else, yes. Also, you can visit Moment's website where you can purchase Have I Got a Cartoon for You? The Moment Magazine book of Jewish cartoons that Bill mentioned earlier. It's edited by former New Yorker cartoon editor Bob Mankoff. Please register for next week's program, from folk tales and fables to Harry Potter, Yiddish storytelling for a new generation. And we kindly ask that you consider making a donation today to Moment to help us continue our programming throughout the coming year. So again, thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a happy and healthy new year, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.